biggest lie in productivity culture is that procrastination is about time management. It isn't. It never was. Procrastination is an emotion regulation problem, and treating it with planners and alarms is like treating a broken leg with a better pair of shoes. That sentence deserves a moment, because it cuts against almost everything the last 2 decades of self-improvement content has been selling. The Pomodoro timer, the time blocking system, the 4th generation planner with color-coded sections, the app that locks the phone, the accountability group that charges a monthly fee. None of these tools are inherently useless, but they were built on a diagnosis that was wrong. And the wrong diagnosis, no matter how good the tool, produces the wrong treatment. Timothy Thikel spent more than 2 decades at Carleton University studying procrastination. Not casually, obsessively. He did not start from the assumption that procrastinators were lazy, undisciplined, or poorly trained in time management. He started from a simple observation. The people who struggled most with procrastination were often highly intelligent, highly capable, and in many cases, fully aware of every time management technique available to human beings. They owned the planners. They read the books. They had tried everything. And they still could not begin. What Thikel found across hundreds of studies was this: procrastination is not a gap in skill. It is a short-term mood repair strategy. When a task is associated with negative emotion, boredom, anxiety, frustration, self-doubt, the fear of failure, the fear of success, the sense of being overwhelmed, the suspicion that the outcome might reveal something uncomfortable about the person doing the work, the brain looks for a way to regulate that emotion. And the fastest, most reliable way to regulate an unpleasant emotion about a task is to not do the task. Check the phone. Watch a short video, reorganize the desk. Respond to an email that didn't need responding to. The negative emotion disappears. Immediately, the relief is real. That is the part that the productivity culture refuses to acknowledge. Procrastination works. In the short term, it is a deeply effective emotional regulation strategy. The brain gets exactly what it wanted: relief from the uncomfortable feeling right now. The cost is paid later in guilt, in missed deadlines, in the slow erosion of self-trust. But later is a problem for later. The brain, in the moment the avoidance happens, has solved its actual problem, reducing the unpleasant feeling associated with that specific task. And this is where the productivity framing becomes not just incomplete, but actively harmful. Because if the diagnosis is poor time management, the treatment is more structure, more discipline, more systems. And when the systems fail, as they will, because they are addressing the wrong variable, the person blames themselves. The planner didn't work, the app didn't work, the schedule fell apart. The obvious conclusion in the productivity frame is that the procrastinator is insufficiently disciplined. More shame follows. And shame, as the research consistently shows, does not reduce procrastination. It increases it. If you have spent years cycling through that loop, new system, brief hope, eventual failure, renewed self-criticism, that is not a flaw in you. That is the predictable output of a diagnosis that was wrong from the beginning. Ushia Sirwas, now at the University of Sheffield, has published extensively on this exact loop. Her work, along with collaborations with Hiko Lee, demonstrates something that sounds almost too simple to be true. People who respond to their own procrastination with self-criticism procrastinate more on the next task. People who respond to their own procrastination with self-compassion, meaning treating themselves with the same kindness they would extend to a friend in the same situation, procrastinate less. The difference is not small. It is measurable, replicable, and consistent across populations. Why does self-compassion reduce procrastination when self-criticism amplifies it? Because the underlying problem was never character. It was emotion regulation. Self-criticism adds more negative emotion to an already negatively charged task. The brain, now facing even more unpleasant feeling associated with the work, reaches for even stronger avoidance. The cycle tightens. Self-compassion, by contrast, does not add new negative emotion. It acknowledges the discomfort without amplifying it. The emotional load around the task decreases. The avoidance loses some of its pull. That finding alone, that kindness toward oneself produces more productive behavior than harshness, is enough to reframe the entire conversation, because it means that the stern inner voice that so many people carry around as a kind of private drill sergeant, the one that calls them lazy, undisciplined, pathetic, hopeless, that voice is not helping. It was never helping. It was part of the machinery that kept the procrastination in place. If you recognize that voice, and most people reading this will, it is worth noticing that it was installed. Somewhere, at some point, a version of that voice was modeled for you. It did not originate as protection, it was inherited as technique, and techniques can be updated. And there is a second layer underneath the emotion regulation problem. A structural one. Hal Hirschfield at UCLA has spent years researching what he calls future self continuity, the degree to which a person feels connected to the version of themselves that will exist in 6 months, a year, 5 years. His research, using brain imaging, found something striking. When most people think about their future self, their brain activates patterns associated with thinking about a stranger. Not themselves, a stranger. And the brain, evolutionarily, is not designed to sacrifice on behalf of strangers. It is designed to prioritize the self that exists right now. That has enormous implications for procrastination. The task that needs to be done today, the difficult conversation, the grant proposal, the workout, the email to the tax accountant, benefits the future self, the person who will exist next week, next month, next year. But the brain experiences the future self as a stranger. So, the cost-benefit calculation, which looks obvious on paper, do the uncomfortable thing now, reap the benefit later, is not operating with the numbers that seem obvious. The current self is being asked to bear the cost. The stranger is the one who will benefit. The brain, faced with this arithmetic, frequently concludes, why should the current self suffer so that this stranger can win? This is called temporal discounting. The brain systematically undervalues future rewards relative to immediate ones. And the more distant the reward, the steeper the discount. A deadline that is 3 weeks away feels almost abstract. A deadline that is tomorrow feels concrete. This is not a failure of character. It is how the nervous system was built. It evolved in environments where immediate threats and immediate rewards were the variables that mattered. It did not evolve for grant applications with deadlines in May. None of this means procrastination is inevitable or impossible to work with. The research also points quite clearly toward what actually helps. And the interventions that work do not look like more planners. They look like tools that either reduce the emotional friction around the task or reduce the temporal gap between current action and experienced reward. The first tool that consistently appears in the research: shrink the commitment until the emotional resistance collapses. Cycle and colleagues have documented something they call the intention-action gap, the space between deciding to do something and actually starting. The gap is almost always wider than people expect, and it is rarely bridged by more resolve. It is bridged by lowering the threshold. A person who cannot start a 30-minute task will often agree to 10 minutes. A person who cannot agree to 10 minutes will agree to 2. The trick is not dishonesty with oneself. The trick is that the emotional regulation problem was activated by the full scope of the task, and a smaller scope produces less avoidance. The decision to work on something for just 2 minutes, genuinely allowing stopping at 2 minutes if desired, reduces the emotional load enough that starting becomes possible. And starting, it turns out, is most of the battle. Research on task completion suggests that once a task is begun, the probability of continuing is substantially higher than the probability of starting from rest. The Zeigarnik effect, first described in 1927, still replicated consistently, shows that unfinished tasks occupy mental bandwidth in a way that completed tasks do not. Starting, even for 2 minutes, converts the task from an abstract threat into a concrete in-progress item. And in-progress items want to be finished. The second tool, well documented by Katie Milkman at the Wharton School, temptation bundling. The core idea is that tasks with immediate emotional cost and delayed rewards, exactly the shape of most procrastinated work, can be paired with activities that provide immediate emotional reward. A person who struggles to exercise might pair exercise with watching a television show they genuinely enjoy, but only during exercise. The guilty pleasure reality show becomes available only on the treadmill. The unpleasant task becomes linked to an immediate positive feeling. The emotional regulation problem, which was the actual mechanism of avoidance, is partially neutralized. Not because the task becomes pleasant, but because the total emotional package of doing the task now includes something the brain actually wants. Milkman's studies on temptation bundling in gym attendance showed measurable, sustained behavior change. Not because people suddenly became more disciplined, because the emotional math changed. The third tool, drawn from Hirschfield's work, shortened the psychological distance to the future self. The brain treats the future self as a stranger, but this is not fixed. It is malleable. Writing a specific letter to the future self, describing in detail the day that person will have, the room they will be in, the feelings they will carry, these practices measurably increase future self continuity. The research is clear that people who engage in these exercises make better long-term decisions. Not because they become more rational, because the stranger, over time, becomes a person, and the brain will, under the right conditions, make small sacrifices for a person it recognizes. There is a pattern in all 3 of these interventions that is worth sitting with. None of them rely on willpower. None of them assume the procrastinator needs to be a different kind of person. All of them work with the nervous system that actually exists, the one that regulates emotion through avoidance, discounts future rewards, and responds to its own mistakes with either shame or kindness, with measurably different results. The interventions do not try to override the system. They reduce the load on it. And this is the reframe that matters most. The task that has been sitting undone for weeks, months, in some cases years. The email that needed to be sent. The difficult conversation that has been postponed. The project that was started and abandoned. That task is not undone because the person is lazy. It is undone because, for whatever specific reason, the emotional load associated with the task exceeded the nervous system's capacity to handle it in the moment of decision. Every time. And shame about that pattern, self-criticism about that pattern, identification with the label procrastinator as a fixed trait, none of these responses address the actual mechanism. They make it worse. The question worth asking, when a task has been avoided for a long time, is not the question of personal discipline. The question is, what specifically about this task feels unbearable? Is it the fear of being judged for the quality of the work? The fear of discovering that the work is harder than it looked? The boredom of the first uninteresting phase? The guilt about how long it has been postponed, which has now become part of what makes starting painful. The feeling that the outcome will reveal something about the self, that a failure on this particular task would mean something more than a failure on that specific task. Each of those underlying feelings has a different intervention. None of them respond to better scheduling. So the honest question, sitting with whatever task has been waiting, is not why starting keeps failing. It is what specifically the task is asking you to feel before it lets you begin. Self-compassion, in this context, is not softness. It is not letting anyone off the hook. It is a technical precondition for the kind of emotional regulation that allows starting. The drill sergeant voice produces more avoidance. The voice that says, "This is a hard task. It makes sense that starting feels uncomfortable. The discomfort is not a verdict on who you are. Just begin for 2 minutes." That voice produces less avoidance. The data is unambiguous, and most people have been using the wrong voice for decades. That can change tonight. The next time a task triggers the familiar freeze, notice which voice shows up. And try once the other one. Saturday, something different. Leaving the brain for a moment. And going somewhere most channels in this space refuse to go, the wallet. The way money and mental health are tangled in ways almost nobody talks about honestly. And what happens when the spiritual community makes desire for financial security into a character flaw.